Arsenic for Tea, Part 2, Chapter 6. Mr. Curtis coughed. He looked surprised at himself, then he coughed again, sharply, as though he were trying to clear something stuck in his throat. That was what we all thought had happened. Shall I get you a glass of water, Dennis? Asked Lady Hastings, putting down her cup of tea. But Mr. Curtis shook his head and put his hand up to his still open mouth. My tongue, he said thickly, I feel... And he actually stuck his finger between his lips and prodded it. I was shocked. You simply do not behave like that at a tea party, not even a children's one, unless you were a baby, which Mr. Curtis was quite obviously not. Ugh, said Mr. Curtis, ugh! And all of a sudden he doubled up in his chair, folding himself over like a paper doll. Then he began coughing again, louder now, until the coughs became retching noises. It was horrid to listen to. It made my own throat tickle. Nasty as Mr. Curtis was, it was awful hearing him suffer. Kitty had her hands over her mouth. Beanie had hers over her eyes. When Mr. Curtis sat up again for a moment, his face had gone white and waxy, and he was making the most dreadful groaning noise, mixed in with the retches. What is it? Asked Beanie. What's wrong? With a cry, Lady Hastings rushed towards Mr. Curtis and put her arm around him. He put his hand over his mouth and heaved. Quick! Lady Hastings cried to Chapman. Fetch Mrs. Doherty and Hetty. Tell them that Dennis has been taken ill and is up in his room. Then she pulled Mr. Curtis, still retching, to his feet and guided him out through the door. Chapman, looking almost as waxy white as Mr. Curtis, tottered after her. I stared around at everyone else. Aunt Saskia had her mouth open and her hands clutched the sides of her face, which looked like a horrid mask. Uncle Felix was standing with his arms folded, his expression very stern. Miss Alston's face was quite blank, but she was clinging to her handbag as tightly as anything. Bertie looked as though he did not know who to be angry at, and Stephen looked as if he might be sick. And then I glanced at Lord Hastings. He was trying to look concerned, as the host of a guest who has just been taken ill ought to, but underneath I could see a nasty sort of pleased expression that did not suit him at all. What's wrong with Mr. Curtis? Beanie kept whispering fiercely. Oh, what's wrong with him? Shut it, Beans, hissed Kitty rudely. What was wrong with Mr. Curtis, I wondered. Was he ill? If he was, it was very sudden. We had seen him out jogging that morning after all. Had he eaten something bad? All I had seen him take was that cup of tea. I felt a pinch on my hip and turned to see Daisy widening her eyes at me. It was as though she had held up a sign. This may be important, said Daisy's eyes. She was right. Strange things kept happening around Mr. Curtis, as though he were a magnet for them. Come on, said Uncle Felix to everyone as we heard voices and feet on the stairs. Out, all of you. He flapped his hands at us, shooing us out of the dining room. I don't see why, complained Aunt Saskia, and then stood in the doorway looking forbidding. I peeped round his arm and saw the tea things all strewn about, and Mr. Curtis's watch and cup still balanced on the arm of the chair he had been sitting in. And then my view was cut off. Toast Dog tried to wriggle his way in between Uncle Felix's legs, and Uncle Felix said, Oh, no, you don't, and shut the door on Toast Dog's nose. Mrs. D, he called, I need the key to the dining room. Mrs. Doherty came flustering out of the kitchen, carrying a bowl of water. Of course, she gasped, it's hanging up in the kitchens, but I must take this up to Mr. Curtis first. Daisy, we can't wait. Go and get the key, said Uncle Felix, not moving. Don't argue with me. Daisy went, looking vague and don't care, though I could tell she was fizzing with excitement underneath. When she came back, Uncle Felix locked the dining room door, put the key in his pocket and went bounding up the stairs to Mr. Curtis's room, his long legs taking 3 treads at a time. I was worried. Uncle Felix was behaving as though something was seriously amiss. What is wrong with Mr. Curtis? Repeated Beanie. Did he eat something bad? My aunt mistook bath salts for sugar once, said Kitty. She was ill everywhere. The house smelled horrible for days. Mr. Curtis hasn't swallowed bath salts, said Daisy scornfully. Don't be silly. I expect he ate something that disagreed with him at lunch. Some of that meat was rather old. Did she believe that? I wondered. One look at her told me she didn't. Oh, no, wailed Beanie. Will we all be ill?" "Most likely," said Daisy, who was clearly in a ghoulish mood. "In fact, I think I feel—" Beanie shrieked and clutched her stomach. "Help!" she cried, and made a dash for the bathroom. Kitty, rolling her eyes at Daisy, went chasing after her. "Daisy," I said, "that's not really true, is it? I don't feel ill. At least I don't think I do." "I know," said Daisy. "Neither do I. In fact, I may not have been entirely truthful with Kitty and Beanie." "When are you ever?" I wanted to say, but I didn't. "So?" I asked. "So? Hazel, haven't we been saying all day that something odd is going on? Mr. Curtis is obviously here for nefarious purposes. We have established that. This could just be a trick to stop Daddy forcing him out of the house this evening. If he's ill, he can stay on at Fallingford." "But I don't think he was pretending," I objected. "Neither do I, really. But if he isn't pretending, well, that is even more interesting. There are all sorts of possibilities, and it is up to us as members of the Detective Society to investigate them further before we draw any conclusions. What do we know so far? Quick, while we are alone." "Mr. Curtis has been behaving oddly," I said. "And now he's been taken ill. It looked like he was going to be sick." "But none of the rest of us are showing symptoms of sickness, although we all ate the same things at lunch," Daisy pointed out. "And we all ate the same food at tea just now." "But Mr. Curtis didn't eat anything," I said. "He only drank that cup of tea." "Excellent observation, Watson," said Daisy. "Good. Now, that tea came from the same pot that we all had our tea from, and the milk from the same jug. So why is Mr. Curtis ill when none of the rest of us are?" Just then Uncle Felix rushed past, pulling on his rain-mack and galoshes. "Are you going out?" asked Daisy. "Going to find O'Brien and fetch the doctor," said Uncle Felix briefly. "Things look bad upstairs, and this storm's playing havoc with the phone lines. Best not to go alone." I did not envy him or O'Brien at all. Things sounded awful outside. I could hear thunder kettle-drumming away and the rain hammering against the window panes, and every so often the outside of the windows was lit up fiercely white by lightning. "If we're not back in half an hour, send out a boat. There's a good niece." Daisy grinned and waved him out, but as soon as the door slammed behind him, her face grew serious. We stared at each other, listening to the rain and the horrid noises filtering down from upstairs. It was pitch black outside now. It felt as though the house was a little wooden box that we were all stuck in together, alone on a deep, dark sea. "What we must do now," said Daisy above the noise of the storm, "is get closer and see what we can discover." Chapter 7. Up the twisting stairs we went, and along the first-floor landing to lurk outside Mr. Curtis's door. We could hear Lady Hastings and Mrs. Docherty fussing about inside. I knew we shouldn't be there. I knew I didn't want to be. Mr. Curtis kept making those horrid wails and groans, and they nearly drowned out the storm outside. Flashes of lightning kept on striking the hallway full of shadows. They made me jump every time. "Honestly, Hazel," Daisy said, but she did not say it with feeling. I think she was beginning to feel as nervous as I was. Then Uncle Felix came back with the doctor from Fallingford village. Unlike Felix, who looked smooth even with rain dripping from his hair and his trousers soaked and muddy, the doctor was fat and bald and flustered and very out of breath. He rushed past us saying, "Out of my way, young ladies, out of my way." Uncle Felix paused beside us. We both tensed, but he only frowned and wiped his wet monocle on his wet pocket square. "We left O'Brien in the village," he told us. "Awful weather, he's better off at home. But at least Dr. Cooper's here now." "What's wrong with Mr. Curtis, Uncle Felix?" asked Daisy, seeing an opportunity. "Will he be all right?" "Stop angling, Daisy," said Uncle Felix. "I'm not going to tell you anything." Daisy looked shocked. "But, Uncle Felix—" "Daisy, this isn't a game. This is serious. Now, I want you both to go up to the nursery and stay there until you're told otherwise. All right?" He glared at us through his monocle, now back in his eye, and then jerked open Mr. Curtis's door and strode in. Daisy was left gaping. She said, "I don't know what's got into him this weekend. He never tells me to go away." I thought back to those strange, worrying things that Uncle Felix had said to Mr. Curtis in the maze. Was he simply behaving like a grown-up, or like a suspect? "What do we do now?" I asked Daisy. "Go upstairs like he told us to?" "Obviously not," she said. "That big Spanish chest over there opens, and there are some lattice bits that make perfectly good air holes. If we hide in there, we can stay and listen." I didn't want to do that at all, but I did want to find out what was going on. "All right," I said. We climbed in, our elbows and knees bumped in the dark, and I felt very hot and claustrophobic. But Daisy was right. There were small holes in the side of the chest that we could breathe through and almost see out of if we squinted. Thunder rumbled and boomed, the rain lashed down against the windows, and Mr. Curtis groaned and groaned. And then his bedroom door opened and someone came bursting out. It was Lady Hastings, and she was simply howling. She held a handkerchief to her face, which had tear tracks all down it, and ran into her room, sobbing. And a few minutes later, just as I was beginning to wonder if I should ever move about freely again, 2 more people came out after her. That's all for today. See you again tomorrow.